Callum Mercer stood between two rows of vines when Marlene Voss pointed toward the gate and told him he no longer had the right to be there. More than 20 residents had gathered along the gravel path, drawn by the sound of her voice carrying across the property like a verdict already decided. She held a clipboard against her chest as though it were a badge of office, and behind her stood two security guards in navy polos, hired for the occasion, their arms crossed in a show of authority neither of them truly possessed. Callum did not raise his voice. He asked her only one question, whether she was certain, and Marlene laughed the kind of laugh that was meant to be heard by everyone standing close enough to feel small because of it. She told the guards to walk him out, and for a moment Callum considered arguing, considered listing the 7 years he had spent turning that patch of Napa soil into something worth defending, but he understood that reasoning with Marlene Voss in front of an audience was a losing game before it began. He gathered nothing. He had nothing on him worth gathering. He simply turned toward the gate, with the guards flanking him, past the mailboxes painted the approved shade of sage green, past the sign that read Private Community in gold lettering Marlene had commissioned herself 3 years earlier. It was 41 years he had lived, most of them quiet, most of them alone, tending land that had never once asked him for anything he could not give it. He had no children, no wife, no family close enough to call in an emergency. The vineyard was not a hobby to him. It was the entire architecture of his days. From the frost checks before dawn, to the pruning in late winter, to the hush of the crush pad in autumn, when the grapes came in heavy and sweet. He had built a life shaped like devotion, and Marlene Voss had just told him, in front of neighbors he had waved to for years, that devotion meant nothing against a clipboard. He thought, standing there, of how ordinary the morning had looked only an hour earlier. He had walked the eastern rows, checking for mildew after 2 days of unexpected humidity, had stopped to fix a length of wire trellis that had come loose in the wind, had made himself black coffee in the same chipped mug he had used every morning for 6 years. None of that had prepared him for the sight of Marlene's sedan pulling up the gravel drive with 2 hired men riding in the back seat, like an entourage assembled for a performance rather than an eviction. He had known trouble was building for weeks. He had not expected it to arrive with guards. The neighbors who gathered were not strangers to him. He recognized the Delgados from 2 lots over, who had once borrowed his tractor for a fallen tree. He recognized old Mr. Ferris, who fed the stray cats along the back fence, and had never once complained about the smell of fermentation drifting from the crush pad in September. Most of them said nothing as Marlene spoke, their silence not quite agreement and not quite dissent, the particular kind of silence that spreads through a crowd when no one wants to be the first to be seen taking a side. The complaints had started small, the way these things always start. A truck parked 2 hours past the posted curfew. Wooden crates stacked too close to the shared road. A storage shed that had not been repainted to match the community palette. Then came the accusation that his harvest operation constituted unauthorized commercial activity, a claim Callum had answered patiently every time, explaining that grapes did not care what the HOA bylaws said about zoning, that agriculture had existed on that hillside, long before the homeowners association had existed at all. Nobody had listened, nobody had wanted to. That morning, Marlene arrived with the guards already in position, as though she had rehearsed the entire sequence the night before. She announced that his rights to the property were suspended, that the association had the authority to remove him from the land effective immediately. Callum asked to see the paperwork, and she handed him a single violation notice, printed on the same letterhead she used for pool schedule reminders. He scanned it twice. There was no signature from any recognized property authority, no seal, nothing but Marlene's own name typed at the bottom in bold. He looked up at her and told her that could argue about it later, and she told him no, that he was leaving now, that later was not an option she was offering. It was at that exact moment, as the guards took a step toward him, that a black sedan rolled slowly up the private road and stopped just short of the gate. The door opened, and a man stepped out with the unhurried calm of someone who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. Silas Beaumont, the owner of the largest winery in the entire valley, looked past Marlene as though she were a fixture of the landscape rather than a person standing in his line of sight, and he asked Callum a single question. He asked whether they had already taken him off his own land. The guards hesitated, unsure whether the man stepping out of that car outranked the woman who had hired them for the afternoon. Marlene straightened her blazer and attempted to reclaim the moment, telling Silas that this was an association matter and did not concern the winery. Silas did not look at her when he answered. He said only that anything happening on this hillside concerned him, and something about the flatness of his tone made even Marlene's practiced composure falter for the first time that morning. He reached into the back seat of the sedan and withdrew a leather folder, thin but heavy, with the particular weight of documents that had waited a long time to be opened. Marlene Vos had held the presidency of the Homeowners Association for nearly 10 years, and in that decade she had built something closer to a small kingdom than a volunteer committee. She dressed the part every single day, blazers pressed, hair set, voice pitched to sound reasonable even when what she was saying left no room for negotiation. She believed, sincerely and without irony, that the association was the true government of the neighborhood, more real in its authority than the county records office or the state itself, and she had cultivated a loyal block of board members who voted however she suggested before she had finished suggesting it. What made her dangerous was not cruelty exactly, it was certainty. She never seemed to consider that she might be wrong about anything, and that certainty had a way of steamrolling anyone who tried to push back with facts instead of fear. Callum had learned this the hard way 8 months earlier, when a development company had approached him about purchasing a strip of land bordering the eastern edge of his property. He had declined without much thought, assuming it was simply one offer among many that vineyard owners fielded every season. The representative who delivered the offer had not taken the refusal well. He told Callum, in a tone that tried very hard to sound like friendly advice, that he would regret the decision. Callum had not connected that conversation to Marlene at first. But the inspection started less than 3 weeks later, arriving with a frequency that felt less like enforcement and more like harassment dressed in official language. Every visit ended the same way, with Marlene informing him that he did not meet community standards, a phrase so vague it could mean anything she needed it to mean on any given day. It took Callum longer than he would have liked to admit that this was never about a shed color or a delivery schedule. Someone wanted him off that land, and Marlene Vos had made herself the instrument of that wanting. He went looking for answers in the property records himself, sitting for hours in the county archive with old deeds and transfer documents spread across a table meant for someone with far more patience than he usually had. What he found troubled him more than what he did not find. A section of the ownership history was simply missing, a gap of years where no clear paper trail existed, and several older documents referenced in the index were nowhere in the physical file. Someone had either lost those records through years of careless handling, or someone had removed them on purpose, and Callum did not yet have enough information to know which. The clerk who helped him that day, a woman named Ruth who had worked the archive for nearly 30 years, mentioned almost in passing that requests for that particular file had spiked in the past year, more people asking after the Mercer parcel's history than she had seen in her entire career combined. She could not tell him who those requesters were, citing privacy rules she seemed genuinely sorry to invoke, but the detail stayed with Callum on the drive home, turning over in his mind like a stone he could not quite set down. Someone else had been looking. Someone else already knew there was something worth finding. Marlene called an emergency meeting less than a week later, gathering dozens of residents into the community clubhouse under the pretense of discussing landscaping violations. She stood at the front of the room and announced, without hesitation, that Callum Mercer no longer held control over the vineyard property. Callum, standing near the back, asked her plainly who did hold that control, if not him. Marlene paused, just long enough for the silence to feel deliberate, and then she said that it would belong to whomever the association recognized. It was in that pause, in the careful construction of that answer, that Callum understood something far more unsettling than a petty dispute over parking. Marlene was not simply trying to push him out. She was trying to install someone else in his place, someone whose claim she intended to manufacture rather than discover, and dressing the entire maneuver in the language of community standards so that no one in that room would think to question it. Silas Beaumont was 61 years old, and owned one of the most respected wineries in the entire region, a name that appeared on wine lists from San Francisco to New York without ever needing an introduction. He rarely gave interviews and almost never appeared at community functions, preferring the kind of quiet influence that did not require an audience to function. When he led Callum away from the gate that morning, past the stunned expressions of the guards Marlene had hired, he did not explain himself right away. He simply asked Callum to follow him to the winery, and something in the way he said it made clear that this was not a suggestion Callum should decline. Once they were seated in Silas's private office, Callum finally asked why any of this mattered to a man who owned thousands of acres and had no obvious stake in 7 of them belonging to a stranger. Silas did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the far wall, lined with framed photographs that looked decades old, sepia-toned images of the valley, before most of the current vineyards existed. He pointed to one image in particular, and Callum recognized the shape of his own land beneath rows of much younger vines. But above the gate in that old photograph was a family name Callum had never once heard in his life. The office itself told its own story. Shelves lined with ledgers going back further than Callum could easily calculate, framed awards from competitions decades past, a single black and white portrait of a younger Silas standing beside an older man, Callum, assumed to be his own father. Nothing in the room felt decorative. Everything looked functional, kept, the way a person keeps things that matter rather than things that merely look impressive to visitors. Silas moved through the space like a man who had spent 30 years memorizing where every document lived, and Callum understood, even before any explanation came, that he was in the presence of someone who treated history as a responsibility rather than a curiosity. Silas explained, slowly and without embellishment, that the vineyard Callum had purchased was never simply a parcel bought and sold through ordinary channels the way Callum had always assumed. It had once been part of a much larger estate, an estate whose ownership had been divided across several transactions over the decades. And somewhere in that division, a portion of the original paperwork had vanished from the official record entirely. Callum sat with that information for a long moment before asking the question that had been circling in his mind since the photograph. He asked why he had been allowed to buy the land so cheaply, far below what comparable vineyard acreage typically commanded in that valley. Silas met his eyes and told him it was because the seller had never actually held complete rights to what he was selling. Then Silas crossed the room to a heavy floor safe built into the wall behind his desk, turned the dial with the unhurried precision of a man who had done it 1,000 times, and pulled out a thin, aged folder. He set it on the desk between them without a word, and Callum opened it to find the first page inside, its ink faded but still legible, bearing a title that made the room feel suddenly smaller. It read, Original Deed, Mercer Estate, and beneath it, a list of names Callum had never seen but somehow, impossibly, recognized the shape of. Silas told him the story slowly, the way a man tells a story he has been waiting years to tell the right person. The land had once belonged, in its entirety, to a family named Mercer, and Callum's first instinct was to dismiss it as coincidence, a shared surname and nothing more, common enough in a country built on generations of families moving west and putting down roots wherever the soil looked promising. But Silas shook his head and told him this was not coincidence. The records tied Callum directly to that lineage, a distant relative who had once held title to the entire stretch of hillside long before it had been carved into smaller and smaller parcels, sold off to cover debts, disputes, and the slow erosion families experience across generations when nobody stays to protect what came before them. Buried within the original transaction, Silas explained, was a clause rarely invoked and even more rarely understood, a provision stating that if any portion of the divided estate continued to be used specifically for viticulture and wine production, the original family line retained a path back to reclaiming full ownership under a narrow set of conditions. It was an old-fashioned kind of clause, the sort attorneys stopped writing generations ago, but it had never been formally struck from the record, and that omission mattered more than anyone involved had likely realized at the time. The conditions were specific and unforgiving. There had to be a direct descendant able to prove lineage beyond reasonable dispute. There had to be evidence that the land had never been legally and cleanly transferred outside the family line in the eyes of the original clause. And there had to be the original deed itself, the physical document, not a photocopy or a summary, because the clause had been written in an era when signatures on paper still meant something the law refused to argue with. The trouble, Silas admitted, was that the original deed had disappeared from public record decades earlier, and the Homeowners Association had been operating for years using an entirely different document, one that made no mention of the clause at all, to assert its authority over the land. Silas explained further that clauses like this one had fallen out of common use for a reason. Attorneys in later decades considered them messy, prone to exactly the kind of dispute now unfolding between Callum and the association, and most families with old estates had quietly amended their deeds to strip such provisions out entirely, favoring the simplicity of clean, unconditional transfers. The Mercer estate, for reasons Silas did not yet fully understand himself, had never undergone that modernization, whether through oversight, stubbornness, or some deliberate choice by an earlier generation determined to leave a door open for the future. The clause had survived every subsequent transaction untouched, buried in language dense enough that most modern reviewers skimmed past it without registering its significance. Marlene, Silas suspected, understood far more about this gap than she had ever let on, and Callum began turning over every interaction he had ever had with her, wondering how long she had known there was a fracture in the paperwork wide enough to drive an entire scheme through. Sitting there with the folder open in front of him, Callum found himself thinking not of Marlene or of Silas, but of his own father, a quiet man who had died 6 years earlier, and who had once told him, for reasons Callum never fully understood at the time, that there were things a person should never sell simply because someone else insisted they had lost their value. Callum had nodded along as a young man does, without truly hearing it. Sitting in that office now, decades later, He finally understood exactly what his father had been trying to tell him. Silas closed the folder and told Callum that he had not brought him there simply to tell a story from the past. He reached into a drawer and set a single brass key on the desk between them, and told Callum, without further explanation, that he wanted him to open a second safe. They spent the following days going through financial records that Silas had quietly gathered over months, long before Callum had ever heard the name Marlene Voss attached to any conspiracy larger than parking enforcement. What emerged from the documents was a company called Vesper Ridge Development, a firm that had spent the past 2 years acquiring parcels across the surrounding hills under a series of shell entities designed to obscure exactly how much land it was accumulating in one continuous stretch. The company's legal representative, it turned out, had attended several homeowners association meetings over the past year, always seated near the back, always introduced as a community consultant rather than what he actually was. Marlene had signed off on multiple zoning modification requests over that same period, changes that meant little on their own, but, taken together, cleared a regulatory path for exactly the kind of large-scale resort development Vesper Ridge specialized in building. If Callum could be removed from the Vineyard, the property would revert, at least in the association's version of events, to a status that made it available for redevelopment, and the resort could finally close the gap between its scattered holdings and become one contiguous project worth considerably more than the sum of its parts. The evidence stacked higher the longer they looked. Email threads between Marlene and the Vesper Ridge representative, careful in tone but unmistakable in intent. Meeting minutes that referenced a private session never disclosed to general residents. Consulting payments routed through an account that traced back, after several frustrating hours, to Marlene's own name. Planning documents that outlined phased construction stretching across the very acreage Callum had spent 7 years cultivating. And finally, almost as an afterthought buried in Silas's files, an audio recording from a closed-door meeting, one where Marlene's voice could be heard discussing timelines for, in her words, clearing the current occupant. Silas's assistant, a sharp young paralegal named Priya, who had been quietly compiling records for weeks before Callum ever knew of her existence, laid the documents out chronologically across a long conference table so the pattern would be impossible to miss. The zoning modifications had begun almost exactly 6 weeks after Callum declined the initial offer on his eastern acreage, too precise a timeline to pass as coincidence. Each subsequent HOA violation notice against Callum lined up, almost to the week, with a corresponding milestone in Vesper Ridge's acquisition schedule. Seen individually, each document looked unremarkable, the ordinary paperwork of small-town governance. Seen together, laid end to end across that table, they read like a blueprint. Callum went to see her alone the next afternoon. No lawyer, no witnesses, just a single folder of copies in his hand. He did not raise his voice when he found her in the clubhouse office. He simply set the papers on her desk and watched her read the first page, then the second, and for the first time since Callum had known her, the practiced calm slid off Marlene's face entirely. She asked him, sharper than he had ever heard her speak, where exactly he had gotten this. Callum told her he had gotten it from somewhere she never imagined he would be capable of reaching. She recovered quickly, the way people like Marlene always do, threatening him with legal action for trespassing on association property, threatening to shut the Vineyard down entirely on public safety grounds she had not yet invented, threatening to ruin him financially with fines she would somehow retroactively justify. Callum let her finish. He did not flinch, and he did not leave. It was only when she realized threats were not moving him that she changed tactics entirely, delivering a line that stopped him cold in a way none of her earlier bluster had managed. She told him he still did not understand the full picture, that he was not, in fact, the only heir with a claim to that land. Callum asked Silas that evening who else could possibly have a legitimate stake in the Vineyard, and Silas, after a long pause that suggested he had been waiting for the question, gave him a name, Avery Holloway. The name meant nothing to Callum, no memory attached to it, no family story he could recall his father ever mentioning, and Silas admitted that Avery had not surfaced publicly in this matter yet, existing instead as a name buried within the same tangle of old legal filings that connected the Mercer estate to its long history of fractured ownership. Callum's first assumption was the obvious one, that Marlene intended to produce this person as a rival claimant, someone she could prop up to muddy the clarity of his own case just as the truth was beginning to take shape. He went digging through the older contracts again, this time with a lawyer's eye borrowed from Silas's own legal counsel, and found something that made his stomach turn. One agreement, decades old, bore a signature that looked subtly wrong under close inspection, the pen pressure inconsistent in a way genuine signatures rarely are. The date stamped on the document did not align cleanly with the broader transaction history surrounding it either, off by just enough to raise questions rather than answer them. Silas studied the page for a long time before saying what they had both begun to suspect, that someone, at some point, had deliberately constructed a chain of falsified paperwork, specifically designed to keep the true ownership of that land permanently unclear. For the first time since this had started, Callum allowed himself to feel something close to despair. He asked Silas, more quietly than he meant to, how he was supposed to win against people who had apparently been rigging the outcome before he had even bought the property. Silas did not offer him false comfort. He told Callum that he did not need to defeat them through strength. That strength was never going to be the deciding factor in a fight built entirely out of paper. He looked down at the folder between them and told Callum that all he needed to do was let the truth quietly dismantle the lie on its own terms. Because lies, unlike truth, require constant maintenance to survive scrutiny. It was 2 days later that Avery Holloway walked into Silas's office, unannounced, and nothing about the encounter matched what Callum had braced himself for. Avery did not carry the posture of someone sent by Marlene to complicate his claim. Instead, Avery placed a sealed envelope on the desk and told Callum, in a voice that carried more relief than confrontation, that his father had kept this hidden for 25 years, waiting for exactly this kind of moment to finally hand it over to someone who would understand what it meant. Avery was younger than Callum expected, perhaps 35, dressed plainly, with the tired look of someone who had been carrying a secret far longer than felt fair for a single person to carry alone. Avery explained that the elder Holloway had served, decades earlier, as the trusted go-between in the original division of the Mercer estate, the man tasked with holding certain records until circumstances made their release necessary. He had died 3 years prior without ever fully explaining to Avery what those documents meant or why they mattered so much, only instructing that they be kept safe and handed over the moment someone came asking the right questions. When word reached Avery, through a cousin who still lived near the valley, that a woman named Marlene Voss was quietly trying to force a vineyard owner off contested land, Avery had recognized, almost instantly, that the moment their father had warned them about had finally arrived. Inside the envelope was a letter, its paper soft with age, written in a hand that belonged to the original owner of the estate, the man whose name had appeared above the vineyard gate in that old photograph on Silas's wall. The letter explained, in careful and deliberate language, why a portion of that land had never been meant to pass permanently out of family hands, regardless of how many times it changed ownership on paper across the following decades. The vineyard, the letter made clear, was never simply a financial asset to be leveraged or sold to the highest bidder. It had been treated, from the very beginning, as something closer to a family inheritance meant to be preserved, a piece of land the original owner had explicitly hoped would never be swallowed into commercial development, no matter how tempting future offers might become. The most important revelation came several pages in. The original deed, the letter explained, had never actually been destroyed or lost through simple carelessness the way official records suggested. It had instead been deliberately entrusted to an intermediary, someone trusted enough to safeguard it until the right person came looking, and that intermediary turned out to share a direct connection to Silas Beaumont's own family. Silas had held a copy of that deed for years, quietly, patiently, waiting for a true heir to surface rather than handing the family's legacy to whoever happened to hold the property title at any given moment. The letter closed with a line that Callum read 3 times before he could set the page down. The original owner had written that land, unlike money, remembered who cared for it, and that no signature obtained through pressure or deception could ever truly erase that memory, only delay the moment it resurfaced. Whoever eventually stood among those vines with honest hands, the letter said, would find that the land already knew them, whether the world's paperwork had caught up to that fact or not. Callum folded the letter carefully along its original creases, aware that he was holding something considerably older and more fragile than any document he had signed at the closing of his own purchase 7 years earlier. Everything clicked into place for Callum at once. His father had known some fragment of this story, he now realized, and had chosen never to share the full weight of it, likely out of fear that dragging old family disputes into the light would only invite more conflict than it resolved. Callum had not simply stumbled into buying this vineyard through blind luck or a favorable market. Someone, quietly and deliberately, had guided him back toward land that had always, in some deeper sense, belonged to his family. He stood alone among the vines that evening as the light faded into gold across the hillside, resting his palm against the rough bark of one of the oldest trunks on the property, and understood, fully for the first time, that he was not simply defending a piece of real estate. He was protecting something his family had fought quietly, across generations, to keep from slipping away entirely. Silas told him that night that they would bring the deed before the homeowners association the following morning, and Callum, for the first time in weeks, felt something steadier than fear settle into his chest. Marlene called the meeting herself, gathering a legal team on short notice and filling the clubhouse with residents who had come expecting to watch. Callum finally forced off the property for good. She stood at the podium with the same practiced composure she always wore, telling the room that the association existed to protect the community, her voice pitched exactly as confidently as it had been the day she first ordered the guards to remove Callum from his own land. Callum walked in with Silas and Avery beside him, and the moment Silas set the original deed on the table at the front of the room, the atmosphere shifted so sharply that even residents who had arrived hostile to Callum fell quiet. What followed was methodical rather than dramatic. Silas laid out the original deed alongside archival records pulled from county storage, historical maps showing the estate's boundaries before subdivision, a full transaction history tracing every transfer of the land across the decades, documentation exposing Vesper Ridge Development's quiet accumulation of surrounding parcels, financial records tying Marlene directly to consulting payments from that same company, and finally the audio recording, capturing her own voice, discussing plans to clear the current occupant from the land. Marlene tried to argue that the deed carried no legal weight in a modern proceeding, but Silas's attorney asked her only one question in response, wondering aloud why the signature of a man she had personally hired to challenge the property's history appeared, ironically on a separate document confirming the very deed's authenticity. Marlene had no answer for that. She simply stood there, silent, for longer than anyone in that room had ever seen her go without speaking. Avery stood next and confirmed the family history in plain terms, tracing the line back through records that left little room for doubt, and Callum followed by producing documentation showing that the Homeowners Association had never actually held any legal authority over vineyard ownership in the first place, only limited jurisdiction over shared community matters like fencing disputes and landscaping standards. It had never possessed the power to remove a property owner from land it did not hold title to, no matter how many notices it printed on official letterhead. A murmur moved through the room as residents began turning toward each other, some recalling notices they themselves had received over the years for similarly minor infractions, wondering aloud, in whispers not meant to carry, but which carried anyway, how many of those notices had ever actually rested on legitimate authority. One board member, a quiet man named Harold who had sat beside Marlene through countless votes without ever once publicly disagreeing with her, raised his hand and asked, in a voice that trembled slightly, whether the board itself had been misled about the scope of its own power all along. Marlene did not answer him. She stared instead at the table in front of her, at the deed, and the photographs and the printed emails arranged in careful order, as though staring hard enough might make them rearrange themselves into something less damning. Marlene rose from her chair, visibly rattled, and asked Callum if he thought he had won. Callum answered simply that he did not think he had won at all. He believed instead that she was only just beginning to understand how much she stood to lose. Silas led Callum back to the winery office the following afternoon and opened the larger of the two safes, retrieving the completed deed alongside the supplementary documentation needed to formalize the transfer through the county records office. He explained that he had, at one point years earlier, been offered the opportunity to purchase that stretch of land outright himself, an offer he had turned down without hesitation once he understood it belonged to the Mercer line. He had simply held the truth in trust, he said, waiting for the rightful heir to eventually appear rather than allowing the land to be quietly absorbed by whoever moved fastest or paid the most. He placed the deed on the desk in front of Callum and told him plainly that this was not a gift. Callum looked up at him, and Silas said, just as plainly, that it was simply something that had always belonged to him. Callum took the paper in both hands, and there was no celebration in the moment, no triumphant noise, nothing but a quiet man staring at his own name, printed at the top of a document that finally matched the truth he had spent weeks fighting to uncover. Callum asked Silas, before they filed the paperwork with the county the following week, why he had never simply told him any of this from the very beginning, why he had waited for the crisis at the gate before revealing what he had known for years. Silas considered the question carefully before answering. He said that truth handed over too easily is rarely believed, that some things a person has to nearly lose before they understand what they were actually holding, and that he had needed to see, with his own eyes, whether Callum was the kind of man who would fight for that land honestly before he decided to hand him proof that would settle the fight entirely. Callum did not know whether to feel tested or protected. In the end, he decided it did not matter. He had passed, whatever the trial had been, and the vineyard was his in every sense that counted. The consequences for Marlene arrived quickly once the deed's authenticity became a matter of public record. An investigation opened into her financial dealings with Vesper Ridge Development within the month. The association scheduled an emergency vote to remove her from the presidency, and the same residents who had once trailed loyally behind every decision she made began quietly distancing themselves the moment her influence stopped guaranteeing anything in return. Vesper Ridge lost its regulatory pathway to develop the surrounding parcels, and every contract tied to the resort project was suspended indefinitely pending further review. The vote to remove Marlene from the presidency passed with a margin so wide it barely required a formal count, and Harold, the same board member who had once sat silently beside her through years of decisions, was the one who read the results aloud, his voice steadier than it had been at the earlier meeting. Marlene did not attend that particular gathering. She sent a brief written statement instead, one that mentioned nothing of apology and everything of procedural objection, a final attempt to frame her removal as a technicality rather than a reckoning. Nobody in the room seemed particularly interested in reading it twice. One neighbor, who had once told Callum outright that he ought to simply leave the community rather than keep fighting, showed up at his gate weeks later to apologize. Callum did not ask for revenge, and he did not offer forgiveness dressed up as a performance either. He simply told the man that he did not need an apology. What he needed was for people to remember that power, no matter how confidently wielded, could never quite turn a lie into the truth. Marlene herself moved out of the community before the following spring. The details of her departure never fully explained to the residents who once hung on every word she said at those clubhouse meetings. Callum heard, secondhand, that she had taken a position with a property management firm 2 counties over, a quieter role with considerably less authority than she had once wielded on that hillside. He felt no satisfaction in hearing it, and no pity either. It simply registered as the natural conclusion to a story that had, for a while, threatened to end very differently. Several months passed before Callum officially became the recognized owner of the vineyard in every sense the law required. He never considered selling it, not for a moment, and he never entertained the idea of converting it into the kind of luxury development Vesper Ridge had once imagined carving out of the hillside. Instead, he restored the old storage barn plank by plank, preserved the oldest rows of vines exactly as they had grown for decades, and began working alongside Silas to produce a new wine specifically drawn from that reclaimed section of the estate. They settled eventually on a name for the label, something that would carry the weight of everything the land had survived. They called it Mercer Legacy, a quiet declaration that the family had finally reclaimed what had once been taken from them through nothing more than paperwork and pressure. Avery visited often during those months, more often than either of them had expected at the start, until the visits stopped feeling like appointments and started feeling like something closer to family, checking in on family. Callum offered Avery a small stake in the new label, not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for a decision that could easily have gone the other way, for an envelope that could have stayed sealed in a drawer for another 25 years, instead of finding its way to the one desk where it could still matter. Avery accepted, and together they planted a new row along the northern edge of the property that first spring, a small addition neither the original deed nor Marlene's schemes had ever accounted for, a piece of the future planted quietly beside all that history. Marlene never returned to any position of authority within the community. She faced the legal and financial fallout of her arrangement with Vesper Ridge largely alone, her once loyal allies having scattered the moment her usefulness to them expired. Callum made no effort to worsen her circumstances beyond what the truth had already done on its own. He let the process run its course without interference, understanding that some forms of justice did not require his participation to finish what they had already started. What began as a business relationship between Callum and Silas slowly settled into something closer to family. Silas stopped being the mysterious figure standing behind locked office doors and old photographs, becoming instead something closer to a mentor, someone who checked in not out of obligation but out of genuine investment in how the vineyard and the man tending it continued to grow. Callum began building a life shaped less by survival and more by choice, no longer simply defending what he had against people trying to take it, but actively deciding what it should become. The first bottles of Mercer Legacy released the following autumn, a modest run compared to what the larger Beaumont label produced each year. But Silas insisted the smallness was the point, that some wines were meant to be found rather than marketed, poured slowly into the hands of people who understood what it had taken to bring them into existence. Callum stood at the small tasting counter he had built himself from reclaimed barnwood the day the first cases went out, watching strangers read the label for the first time, most of them with no idea of the fight buried inside those 2 simple words. He preferred it that way. The wine did not need to explain itself to be good, the same way the land had never needed anyone's permission to remain exactly what it had always been. On a quiet morning sometime later, Callum stood among the vines as the sun came up over the eastern ridge, the light moving slowly across leaves still damp with dew. A framed copy of the deed hung on the wall of the small office near the barn, visible through the window if he turned just slightly to look. Beside it now hung the old sepia photograph Silas had given him as a gift once the paperwork was finalized, the same image that had once startled Callum into silence in that first meeting. A name above a gate that had taken him weeks to understand was, in every way that mattered, his own. No one would ever again be able to stand at that gate and tell him he had no right to be there. He allowed himself a small, quiet smile, then walked back toward the house and closed the door behind him. The camera of memory, if such a thing could be said to exist, pulled slowly back from that single house until the entire vineyard came into view, beneath the morning light, rows upon rows stretching toward the hills, every vine a small and stubborn proof that some things, once nearly lost, can still find their way home. They had once believed that a single signature was enough to force him off that land. What they never accounted for was the simple truth that certain places are never meant to be handed to whoever offers the highest price. They are, in the end, returned only to those with the courage to stand and protect them.